Wonderful. I didn't realize it was 1 minute past, so we're gonna get started because, as always, we always run out of time. As per usual, I always have a few slides I want to highlight before we get started with our presentation. Welcome today. Before I get started, thank you for joining us. So I was asked to kind of highlight this, which is amazing, that the data warehouse is going to have in-person or hybrid office hours. They've already started with this initiative and they're going to sort of run it until December 11th. If they see there is an interest and there's a continuous need, I think the intention is to start up again after the holidays. But the point is that if you have questions about whether or not you can access data through the data warehouse, how, anything regarding feasibility with your research projects and accessing data, anything that you need to sort of ask regarding data access to optimize your study and your research, this is an opportunity for you to do that in person or through Teams. So they have a hybrid option. It's every Wednesday from 10 to 12 in EM2, so at the Glen, the Research Institute Pavilion, 3010. And on Teams, this would have had a hyperlinked link to the Teams access, but because it's a presentation, you should just contact them for the link, okay? Okay, again, I often say I'm gonna continuously present the slide every time we have a presentation. For those of you who have never attended one of my presentations before, we just want to emphasize that if you're submitting a project in Nagano for review, you cannot start your research with REB approval alone, regardless of what type of study you have. Okay, whether it's an interventional study or a data access HRR study, health records research study, you need to wait for MUHC authorization because the authorization takes into account all the other feasibility reviews that the institution performs for approving your study. Okay. Just FYI, you know whether or not you've had authorization issued if both on your screen you'll see there's two lanes that are in red that are sort of squared off in red on the slide. If both your project and your office style or your REB office lanes show that they've been approved and authorized, then you know that you're ready to go. Okay, and you would have had an authorization letter issued to you. Okay, so today it's our sixth session of Community Connect. We are going to be tackling the topic of Health Canada medical device regulations and ITAs. And we're very lucky to have Laurie Anderson presenting again today for us. She was there at our last session. And at our last session, she presented clinical trial applications. So today there's a focus on medical devices, which is a very interesting topic considering how things are evolving and innovating in our society, in our world these days. As per usual, you can code this hour as training on your Logibec timesheet if you're an RI employee. You do that by just putting in 1 hour as train, and in the employee comment, you can add training community of practice. Okay. And one last word, I have decided to schedule one last community connect before the holidays. I can't believe we're already talking about the holidays, but it's coming up quick. So it's scheduled for November 27th, and this time it's going to be a 2 hour session. Okay, so get ready, get yourself ready for this. And the reason is because we've had themes to our sessions in the last little bit. This is going to have no particular theme, but it's going to address topics that have come up quite regularly. And it's going to be topics on Nagano, topics on RI processes. The topics are varied, probably mostly Nagano. And so I'm referring to it as a multi-topic session or Thanksgiving leftovers. I was talking to others about it because it feels like these are all the leftovers from the other sessions that we never got to. Okay, so stay tuned for an invite, but it's going to be November 27th from 10 to 12 p.m. Microphones are muted. You can ask your questions in the chat, but I think we're going to do like last time, Susan. We're going to leave it to the end so that Lori can get through her content. Okay. And this session will also be recorded as in the past. Okay. Lori, I'm passing the baton to you.
Thank you, Josie. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with everyone today. My name is Lori Anderson. I'm a regulatory consultant. I've been doing Health Canada applications now for 20 plus years, and I do submissions to all four directorates, so drugs, biologics, natural health products, and medical devices. So today we're going to chat about medical devices, which is always as Josie said, a fun topic to talk about. I'm just going to share my slides here. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is Health Canada medical device regulations and ITAs, which are investigational testing authorizations. As a disclaimer, particularly in this space, things are changing quite rapidly. Also, there's a lot of different interpretations that we're going to discuss throughout this presentation. So I wanted to just make it clear that I have no association with Health Canada. I am not speaking on Health Canada's behalf. I'm really just hoping to give you a more pragmatic view of the medical device space in Canada. So in Canada, medical device regulations fall under the Food and Drug Act. And Part 3, medical devices for investigational testing involving human subjects, is really the regulations that we're going to be discussing today. It's always important to know when we talk about things like having to do an ITA, just remembering that these are embedded in legislation. So these are obligations that we have under law. So one of the really important fundamental things when you start even talking about ITAs is really what is the definition of a medical device? Because if you are representing your product as a medical device, then obviously we're going to have to look in terms of whether ITAs are required. Some people may have a device that they're not representing as a medical device, but you have to be really clear that you understand what that is. So a medical device, we're really looking at a device that's being used to diagnose, treat, mitigate, or prevent disease, a disorder or an abnormal physical function, or any of the symptoms in human beings. So animals are not considered here. The other thing is looking at restoring, modifying, or correcting body structure or function. So these are the two most important things that you need to think about when you're considering your device. And it really looks to or speaks to what is the intended use of your device and the indications for use. The other important thing to talk about is what is a manufacturer. I think we all typically look at a manufacturer as being a corporation, industry partner, but Health Canada does note that an academic institution can meet the definition of a manufacturer if the institution is the designer and owner of the device. So quite frequently in academia, we do have devices that are either legally owned by the institution, by the PI who has created it, or perhaps an academic spin-off company. So I just wanted to give some examples of device classes. In Canada, sorry about that, we have 4 device classes. It's a little bit different in the US, they only have 3. So sometimes we have to be careful that we recognize that our device classification structure in Canada might be different than in other jurisdictions in the world. Class 1 devices are our lowest device class. They contain things such as bandages, syringes, wheelchairs, and Class 1 medical devices do not require ITAs. The next class we look at is a Class 2. That's our second lowest class device. So here I've got some examples, surgical gloves, TENS machines. We see a lot of electric stimulator devices that fall into this category. A fun one to consider is that the Apple Watch ECG app is a medical device. So the watch itself is not, but the app on that device is a Class 2 medical device. Digital thermometers was really important to consider during the pandemic, making sure that when people were acquiring digital thermometers for use, that they were licensed. Class 3 medical devices are more moderate risk devices. So you'll look here, dental implants, ultrasound systems, some stents, IUDs. And then finally, Class 4 is our highest risk device. And here you'll see things such as pacemakers, angioplasty catheters, a lot of monitors, bone graft, tissue heart valves. So that just gives you an example of what the classification system in Canada looks like. So how do you know if the device that you want to use is licensed in Canada? Similar to drugs, the Medical Devices Directorate has a database we affectionately refer to as MDAL that you can go to, and it'll give you a listing of all of the licensed Class 2, 3, and 4 medical devices offered for sale in Canada. Class 1 devices are not listed here, but you will find your 2, 3s, and 4s. So the onus is on the manufacturer to make the representation in terms of whether or not their product is a medical device and what class it is. And this is really based, again, I'm going to keep harping on this. What is the intended use and the indications for use of the device? Those statements are really, really going to drive whether or not you are a medical device and will help us determine the classification. You have to, of course, consider Canadian definitions and classifications when you're looking at this. So Health Canada has two really nice guidance documents, one for in vitro diagnostic devices and one for non-in vitro diagnostic devices that help you through this classification. Our 9 non-IVDD world, this is what you will actually find contained within that guidance. Health Canada gives you 4 classes to go through, and based upon what rule you fall under, it will help you determine what the classification of your device is. So we look at invasive devices, non-invasive devices, active devices. So, those are devices that have like power, and special rules. So now we've considered, are we a medical device? We think we know what our class of medical device is. Well, what is this ITA thing that we're talking about here? So an ITA is an investigational testing authorization. Again, this is found under Part 3 of the medical device regulations. And what it is it authorizes the sale and or importation of an unlicensed medical device into Canada for investigational testing involving humans. So similar to a no objection letter for drugs, the way that the language actually is written is that they're authorizing sale and importation, not the protocol itself. So that's kind of a funny little issue that I'm hoping is going to get fixed soon. Really important to notice here that sale does not mean necessarily an exchange of monetary money or goods. Distribution encompasses sales. So if you get a product in kind, a device in kind, it would still fall under these regulations and the need for an ITA. An ITA can only be submitted by a manufacturer or importer. Really important here as well, if you want to use a device that's not licensed in Canada, that perhaps is licensed in the EU or in the US, you're going to have that manufacturer on board to not only be able to provide you the information to complete the ITA, but they're going to have to sign off on the application form for your study if you're doing a PI-initiated trial. So you have to have that buy-in. They do allow that the clinical and regulatory activities can be assigned to the QI or the qualified investigator by the manufacturer, so they can allow you to be the one who corresponds with Health Canada. The ITA is specific to a study protocol. So if you get authorization from Health Canada for use of a device that's unlicensed, you're going to be using it in one of your studies, it is only specific to that protocol. You can't be using that device in numerous different protocols because you have an ITA authorization. It has to be specific to that one protocol. And what you get is actually called a letter of authorization from the Medical Devices Directorate that allows for that sale and or importation of the device. So how do you know if you need to submit an ITA? Health Canada has a guidance document that many of you may have seen. And I put this in here because it's really important to note that guidance documents really are not law, and Health Canada will always go back to what is in the medical device regulations under the Food and Drug Act. And this guidance document has caused a lot of grief for a lot of people in terms of interpretation of certain elements, and we'll discuss that today. So Class 1 devices, there's no requirement to submit an ITA. But you must obtain that medical device from a legal holder of a medical device establishment license or a distributor. So they have to be allowed to manufacture or sell that device in Canada. The regulations permit the manufacturer or importer of a Class 1 device to sell to a qualified investigator for the purposes of conducting investigational testing. So again, that's, looking at what that authorization actually is. There's a requirement still to possess records and information under Section 81 of the medical device regulations if you're using a Class 1 unlicensed medical device in a clinical trial. And you still do, of course, need to get REB approval. And just kind of a fun note that as of May 2020, unlicensed Class 1 medical devices were able to be legally obtained from Amazon. And this is an issue, and actually Class 2 devices too. We had during the pandemic, particularly with digital thermometers. People were purchasing these on Amazon because they could, but they really weren't allowed to be using them on patients without authorization if they were not licensed in Canada. So we're class 2 to 4 medical devices are really what require ITAs. This is the famous Health Canada schematic of what requires an ITA and what doesn't. And it's actually a really nice little chart to use, but we're running into a few issues with it lately that we'll discuss. So we'll go through these scenarios here. So if you were doing an investigator-initiated trial with human participants with an unlicensed class 2, 3, or 4 medical device being used in any capacity an ITA is required. This is really important. A lot of people will say, well, I'm not using this device, I'm not studying the device, I'm just using the device to elicit a response. In Health Canada's mind, it doesn't matter. If you are using that device in a human participant, an ITA is required if that device is unlicensed in Canada. Again, you must have the cooperation of the manufacturer, who has to be the official applicant and signatory on the application. You do not need to do an ITA if there is no sale of the medical device based on the definition of sale. And so this would apply if your device is being developed, manufactured, and tested in a single corporate entity at a single site and no sale has occurred. So no distribution, single site, single corporate entity. This scenario is something that academics we've really appreciated over the years because in-house testing happens. The issue we're running into lately with this is Health Canada is now saying that on top of it being developed, manufactured, and tested within a single corporate entity at a single site, it can only be done by the PI, who must be the legal manufacturer. So there's a lot of people who are trying to get a different interpretation on this because that will dramatically change practice for us in academia. Important to note, the testing must be limited to the single site at the single corporate entity. You do not need to do an ITA if you're using a licensed device according to its licensed indications for use. You also do not need to do an ITA if you're using a licensed medical device outside of its intended use, unless you're doing that to generate data for the manufacturer to support a licensing application. And again, those two are pretty much the same scenario. So I referred to Section 81 prior, saying, well, if you have a Class 1 device you're using in a trial, you have to adhere to Section 81 of the medical device regulations. So this is just showing you that Health Canada really expects you to do a lot of record keeping. These Section 81 requirements also apply to all Class 2 through 4 devices used in investigational testing. So as you will see, when we do an ITA, it's not just the application we're going to do, but there's a lot of ongoing obligations associated with that. So from the guidance document, you will see this is what the outline of our ITA submission looks like. We have a cover letter and executive summary, which basically gives a brief description of the device, its intended use, any predicates to which we are comparing it, little information about the manufacturer, and oftentimes the study team. Our application form, which I noted before, we're going to have to get signed by the manufacturer. Any pre-submission correspondence we've had with Health Canada, looking for an interpretation as to whether or not they believe we need an ITA, or perhaps with trying to see if they will agree with our classification. Our introduction section includes manufacturer and importer information, our device identification. So usually that's, a model number, something specific to the device. We also include our class of the device there and how many devices we'll be requesting for use under the ITA. The device description, our design philosophy. We also include in that section comparison to predicate devices. Our indications for use and intended use, there they are again, and any contraindications to using the device. Device labeling, there's a little bit of, this isn't just providing a label. This is where we'd have our operator's manual, our instructions for use. So that's, a section that has few more components in it. And then our marketing history. Risk assessment is expected for class 3 and 4 devices. Health Canada can also ask for it for class 2 devices. Previous studies, which we'll talk about a little bit further. Any alternate treatments or testing options and precautions. Then we have institutional information. And then, of course, our protocol, if we have a study IB, if it's a class 3 or 4 device, and our informed consent documents. So class 2 devices have fewer ITA requirements than class 3 and 4 devices. You will see I've outlined them here. We basically going through what we just did. When it comes to previous studies, what they are looking for here is if you have patient-facing components, you've done biocompatibility testing, any electrical safety testing, electromagnetic compatibility, clinical and preclinical studies, shelf life, any mechanical and bench studies. They'll look for disinfection, packaging information, and any sort of supportive reference articles that may be necessary there. And again, just noting in the device labeling, that's where we have our IFU, our operator's manual, and our product manual. Again, you must possess the records contained in section 181 of the MDRs, and you must have REB approval. This does not have to go in with your ITA at the time, but it must be provided to Health Canada prior to commencement of any study-related activities. Class 3 and 4 devices are higher risk devices. We have more requirements here. Again, here's where we'll see you need a design philosophy, you need a marketing history, which may be nothing. A risk assessment, basically showing what risks have been identified, how you've mitigated those risks, and what risks remain. Again, our previous studies, and the additional one here is signed investigator agreements. This is basically having the qualified investigator or any qualified investigator attest to the fact that they will, follow the protocol, follow the MDRs. Health Canada has started asking for this sometimes for class 2 device ITAs as well. So it might be good practice just to send them in with any ITA. Ongoing obligations to the manufacturer or importer really only affects you if you are the manufacturer or importer. Again, you cannot advertise your medical device without clearly indicating it's investigational if you're using it in a trial. You should, if you're starting to manufacture a product that you think you're going to look to commercialize, make sure that you implement a quality management system. Health Canada does not have a set time period for record-keeping requirements like they do for drugs. So they leave it up to the clinical institution. Most people that I see are just adhering to the 15-year rule like they do for drugs. You have to keep distribution records. Any mandatory problem reporting needs to be submitted to Health Canada, and you have to have a process in place to handle any complaints. So this can all be a little overwhelming. And so I thought I'd pragmatically talk about, do I really need to do an ITA? These are the questions that I get all day long. The first one is, I'm using a device that's designated for research purposes only. We're going to dive into this in the next slide, so we'll come back to that one because that one is a little bit of a can of worms. I have so many trials with the device, I can't do an ITA for each one. Unfortunately, you have to, and there's no way we can get around that. Again, speaking to that guidance document, people will say, I'm not investigating the safety or efficacy of the device. Health Canada will tell you that if you're touching a human with an unlicensed device, unless there's a certain circumstances, you're going to need to do an ITA. I'm not using the data obtained from use of the device to make clinical decisions. Again, that doesn't prevent you from having to do an ITA. I've already purchased the device and received Health Canada approval under an ITA. Can my colleagues use it when I'm done? You are supposed to be returning devices to the manufacturer once you've completed a study. However, if you were to keep it and someone else wanted to do the study with it, they certainly can, but they're going to have to do their own ITA. The device has been granted a 510(k) exemption by the FDA. Health Canada doesn't care. The approval for the device I'm using expired due to the implementation of the MD-SAP program. I can still use it, right? So the MDSAP program is the medical device single audit program whereby participating countries can basically fall under a single audit for the manufacture of that device. When this was implemented in Canada, I believe it was 2019, a lot of companies refused to follow the MDSAP audit program because it was expensive for them to go through it and get this approval from the program. So a lot of devices, their licenses lapsed during this period. If you procured a product prior to that device lapsing, you can use it unless you need to get an accessory for it. Then you would need to do an ITA. So if you had some sort of an electrical stimulator device and now you needed to get new leads for it, unfortunately, you need to do an ITA because that product is no longer licensed and you no longer fall under that ability to use it prior to its license lapsing. I'm not doing a clinical trial. This is academic discovery work. Again, Health Canada doesn't make this distinction. My colleagues at other institutions are using it without having submitted to Health Canada. Unfortunately, this happens, but if you're working, if you're in an institution where I'm working, I'm generally going to tell you that's unfortunate that the other institution doesn't understand, but to be in compliance, you need to do that ITA. So when we talk about research use only, here is our difficulty. The FDA has a research use only designation. If a device is labeled as for research use only, it's not subject to FDA regulation, and the manufacturer does not need to list it with the FDA. Research use only devices, according to the FDA, are intended for performing basic scientific or animal research in the search for a diagnostic hypothesis or intended use for a new diagnostic device. Canada only had a research use only provision for COVID-19 tests, and that was under the interim order, which has now expired. So, and when they were talking about these two, they were really only dealing with IVDDs. So they have the interim order is no longer in effect. There is no real stated guidance around research use only devices. I reached out to Health Canada in October, trying to help out an investigator who really is using a device for research use only. There is no diagnostic, prognostic implications whatsoever, and it's really discovery work. And Health Canada did tell me that they will consider research use only testing on a case-by-case basis. So I'm encouraged by that perhaps they're recognizing that this is a pathway that needs to be opened. So here are points of confusion. The name ITA implies the authorization of a clinical study versus the sale or importation of the device. The regulations are old. They're from 1999, and they do not do a good job of considering academia. This is unfortunately a problem that we can't seem to avoid. Academics are treated exactly the same as industry. There are no separate pathways for investigator-initiated trials. In the 2018 guidance document, we run into issues that we will go into here. The definition of sale, people will say, well, I'm not selling the product to my colleague. Again, we have to remember that it is not restricted to commercial or monetary sale and includes transactions without consideration, such as devices being provided by the manufacturer to the investigator free of charge. So sale does not, again, have to mean that there's an exchange of funds. There is no definition of sponsor. So people tend to be confused as to what the roles and responsibilities are of the manufacturer, of the qualified investigator. So that is an issue. The definition in the guidance of a clinical investigation refers to a systematic investigation in one or more human subjects to assess the safety and or performance of a medical device. So here's where people will come and say, well, I'm not testing the safety or performance of the medical device. I'm just using it to do X, Y, Z. Again, I've had in-person meetings with Health Canada. We have tried desperately to argue this fact, but if it is a medical device and the intended use statement is representing it as such, you're going to have to do that ITA. Here's our single corporate entity issue. We Does the physician using the device have to be the legal manufacturer? Currently, I don't know. Up until a month ago, everybody looked at the wording in the guidance document that really just spoke to single corporate entity, single site. But now there is in FAQ 3 a statement that says, in the case where the physician is the legal manufacturer, and this is now seeming to be interpreted as what needs to happen versus just an example, as most people would have seen it. So we also have to consider that software is a medical device in certain situations. Health Canada has a nice guidance document on software as medical device definition and classification. So Health Canada considers software a medical device as a medical device when it's intended to be used for one or more medical purposes as outlined in the definition of a device in the Act. So we're going back to that diagnose, treat, prevent, cure, or mitigate disease, or alter or restore physical function. And it performs these purposes without being part of a hardware medical device. So it's not necessary for the hardware medical device to achieve its intended medical purpose. Health Canada generally interprets medical purposes as intended to acquire, process, or analyze medical image or signal from an in vitro diagnostic device, or pattern signal from signal acquisition system or imaging device, or intended for the purpose of supporting or providing recommendations to healthcare professionals, patients, or non-healthcare professional caregivers about prevention, diagnosis, treatment, or mitigation of a disease or condition. So how do we classify software? So first thing we need to consider is, again, is this a medical device per the Health Canada's definitions? And then what is the intended use of the device? So what is the significance of the information provided by the software? And what is the state of the healthcare situation or condition that it's intended for? So then we're going to use our intended use statement and product labeling to verify that it meets SAMD inclusion criteria. We're going to classify the software, whether it be an IVDD or a non-IVDD, compare the classification to other examples or predicates, and then save your classification and your rationale in your company records. Really important when you're in any sort of product development to always be having a rationale for either why you are or are not considering your product to be a medical device and what your classification rationale is. Really looking at that guidance document, looking at whether you're an active device, invasive, non-invasive, looking at that rule and being able to quote those specific conditions. So within the guidance, Health Canada has a software exclusion criteria, little pathway you can follow. And this basically has you look at 4 questions. And if the answer is yes to all of the 4 questions, the software is excluded. And so you're not going to be considered as software as a medical device that's going to need to be falling under an ITA. So if we are a medical device, what we need to also look at is, what are we doing? Are we treating and diagnosing? Are we just trying to driving patient management? Are we just informing? And then what would happen? Like what kind of a condition are we dealing with? Are we dealing with basically a non-serious health condition, a serious health condition, or something critical? And when we look at this table here, this helps us decide what classification that we fall into. Looking here, it's important to note when you look at if it's a 2 or 3, that erroneous result issue, if an erroneous result could lead to an immediate danger, you're automatically going to be a class 3. So some examples of non-IVD software as a medical device. So software that's intended for use in rehab. So if you're looking at range of motion assessment, that is often a class 1 software as a medical device. Class 2, we're looking at software that manipulates or analyzes images. Often we look at people that are doing, there's a lot of radiology softwares out there that I'm starting to see people using AI-driven algorithms and machine learning to try to look at eventual treatment or prognosis of disease. Again, so here's software that uses algorithms to analyze information such as blood pressure, heart rate, and age to determine a treatment plan, or software that calculates % breath density from a mammogram. And then class 3 would be, again, our higher risk. So software that performs diagnostic image analysis for treatment decisions in patients with acute stroke, or software that has information from an implantable device allowing the user to monitor their own condition. Because again, if an erroneous result is provided, that could provide immediate danger to the patient. For our IVDD examples, looking at a software app that, for example, would read a urinalysis test strip, or software that's using prenatal screening, right? If we're looking at congenital abnormalities, possibility of predicting those using software. So we don't have to worry about software as a medical device if we're looking at software that's intended for administrative support for healthcare facilities, or software that enables communication and workflow, patient scheduling, helping patients maintain or encourage a healthy lifestyle, like a general wellness app where we provide them dietary tips or exercise tips. Software that provides patients with simple tools to organize their health information. Software intended to serve as an electronic patient record or allow patient access to their health record, and software to be used as like an annotation tool for diagnostic or prognostic reports. So we're starting to see a lot more of those too. This guidance document is also very good. It gives a lot of classification examples for software as a medical device. So I would strongly suggest taking a peek at that if you're looking at doing software as a medical device trial. So my main takeaways are: authorization is required prior to sale, procurement, or distribution of an unlicensed Class 2 to 4 medical device. Failure to comply can result in confiscation, study suspension, and fines. And an unlicensed medical device can only be used in humans in the following situations. If it's Class 1 and the records required under Section 81 are maintained, you've received an ITA. If you are developing, manufacturing, and testing within a single corporate entity at a single site without distribution, or if you've obtained special access approval. Important, really important, if you're unsure, reach out, ask someone. You don't want to be that person who goes to publish a paper and someone asks you if you had authorization for use of the device in your trial, or have Health Canada catch wind of a trial for which you have not done an ITA. What's coming? Makes me so excited and I can hardly wait. I just don't know when it's coming. But right now, Health Canada is going through the CT mod process, modernizing clinical trial regulations. We first heard about this in the summer of 2021. So it's been 3 years, but it sounds like there is some movement. So the proposed modernization is looking at some key proposed changes, looking at proportional risk-based approaches to evaluating these types of trials. So would a low-risk study require less regulatory oversight or post-authorization requirements? Single authorization of a trial for people like me who do trials that sometimes that have a device and a drug, or a device and a natural health product, having to go to 2 directorates and do 2 different submissions and have everybody agree, plus your REB, is often very daunting. So having that single authorization of the trial would be fantastic. Looking to be more agile in our approaches at Health Canada, enabling decentralized trials so that people, in remote areas do not have to be traveling to centers to necessarily be a clinical trial participant. And then ensuring that there is registration and disclosure of results. So what they are looking at for medical devices, some changes, is looking to change the name from investigational testing authorization to a clinical trial authorization. So by doing so, if we did that across all directorates, we would have nice consistency for that single submission. Looking, as I say, to have a definition of a sponsor, because we don't really have that right now. So, they want to look to include manufacturers, importers, as well as investigators. So that would be great too. And it would really help us understand what the roles and responsibilities of each party are when we undertake this process. Looking for a single authorization pathway for combination trials. Making sure that we understand when the REB approval is required, because right now there's some difference in language in terms of when you have to have your RIB approval into Health Canada when you're doing an ITA. Changes to how changes in the authorization. Right now, we're not supposed to be making significant amendments to an authorization. So changing that so there can be better amendment structures within the ITA process. And then being able to suspend a product, a site, an arm, or an entire trial without having to cancel the entire trial. Other proposed changes is making sure that people have ISO 14155 GCP training, flexibility of the use of off-label use of marketed devices under specific criteria, more flexibility for in-house trials. So that's our single corporate entity issue that we're having. The regulator wants to have the ability to impose terms and conditions at any time during a clinical trial. Reporting of discontinued and resumed studies, which I think most people do, but perhaps not. And then registration of medical device trials and public disclosure results. So that's all I have for you. So I will stop screen sharing.
Hi, Lori.
Hi.
Hi. So that's all you have for us, but it feels daunting. There's so much in there. I'm sure everyone else also feels the same way. We're glad to have you on our side so that if our community and anybody out there who's listening and doesn't know where to start with this because it seems overwhelming, Lori has provided some references to resources, right? So the guidance document and some of the other things she's mentioned in her presentation. So Lori, I just wanted to, before we go to questions, because I think there are some questions in the chat and maybe here in the room, I don't know, Marie, Renaud, maybe there's some questions. But I just wanted to sort of emphasize and give like a general summary of my takeaways here. And that's, very, very importantly, an unlicensed class 2, 3, 4 device that's being used in a study needs an ITA, correct me if I'm wrong, even if the device itself is not being tested.
Correct.
Correct. Okay. The other thing I took away, so in other words, like you might be using, I mean, I don't remember what the different examples of the different class devices are, but you might be using some sort of, hypothetically speaking, class 2 gauze that's unlicensed to put on a wound of a patient who's in your study. And if that gauze is unlicensed and it's considered class 2, again, it's hypothetical, you need an ITA for that product.
Yeah, because we're trying to ensure, Health Canada is trying to ensure participant safety. So
Right.
the product is unlicensed and they don't, they have not had eyes on it.
Right.
And, my advice, honestly, if you're looking at a device and you can find one that's licensed, go for the licensed device.
Right. Yeah. My other takeaway is just because something is commercially available to purchase doesn't mean it's licensed in Canada.
That's correct, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, which is what you were suggesting happened during COVID with the digital thermometers. So just because you have access to something that's commercially available that you need to use in your study, if it's unlicensed, you need an ITA because we've had a couple of cases come through our institution. Okay. So I'll leave my end of it at that. Susan, do you want to address some of the questions?
The first question is from Alex Baldwin regarding research use only being considered on a case-by-case basis. Does this mean researchers need to approach Health Canada to present their case? Is there an established way to do this without submitting for an ITA?
Yes. So I would strongly suggest sending them. What I would generally do is send them just a brief description of what the project is, right? If you have a protocol, that would be ideal. What the project is, what the device is, what is your intended use of the device in the product. So for example, let's say you're using some sort of an adaptive device for movement and you don't really know what you're going to do. You want to see if you can just make some modifications to it, make it work better. So you're not using it at all for treatment, diagnosis, prevention, mitigation of disease. You're really just trying to learn more about the device and what its applications may be in the future. Just approaching MDD with that, asking for, I don't like asking for opinion. I like to say, we consider this to be a research device and you're looking for confirmation. So instead of saying, I would rather say, do you agree with it than what is your opinion? But just making the case with them to MDD. And I'm always happy to help anyone who needs help framing those pieces of correspondence because I do it all the time.
Okay, Alex had a follow-up question, so I'm going to skip straight to that. Related to my previous question on research use only, am I right in thinking these regulations are concerned only with the country where the study is performed? So a Canadian manufactured device used in a study in the USA benefits from the FDA's definition of a research use only device.
Correct. Health Canada only regulates what occurs in Canada. If you have sites for a study in Canada and the US, they don't touch the US side of things.
Cindy Intini asks, says, thanks, Lori. What about licensed medical devices used off-label? This does not require an ITA. Also, what about MLMD?
So currently, if you're using a licensed device off-label, according to Health Canada's schematic chart, you do not need an ITA, provided you are not using that device to then provide data to the manufacturer for which they could make additional licensing claims. And then what was the acronym?
MLMD.
LMMD.
MLMD, like Mother Lima, Mother David.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that's referring to.
Or maybe
machine learning? Oh, machine learning medical
yeah.
devices. So that our machine learning medical devices, whether it's a hardware-based device or obviously the software, you're going to be regulated. But if it's licensed, again, if you're using a licensed device in Canada, you can use it in any which way you see fit as it currently stands, according to the Health Canada guidance document, as long as you're not doing the work on behalf of the manufacturer.
The last one's just more of a comment than a question. It's from Gilbert Matt. Very interesting. As a member of the REB, this presentation is providing us more insight about requirements for local researchers. Thanks.
So yeah, when it comes to the REBs, I think the REBs have like such an important role, like an incredibly important role, because oftentimes you're going to be the first people who see this protocol and maybe identify, oh, there's a device in here. Is this licensed? And again, I do work with some institutions, and what they will do is they'll reach out to me and then I'll help them investigate whether or not the device is licensed and whether or not an ITA is required. But the REB, oh my gosh, such an important role in helping us stay compliant when it comes to these things.
So, Lori, speaking of the REB, we have the chair of the REB here in the house. She has a comment or a question. I'm just going to pass her the mic.
Yeah, Marie. Hi, Lori.
Hello.
The camera doesn't. Maybe I'll walk up to the front because I don't know what's important because we probably have something to work on together. So my comment is seeing as
Hold on,
I'm a bit taller than
there you go, stand up. There you go.
Seeing as B's role is to support the interests of the participants, which means protecting, ensuring their safety as well as promoting good science. And beyond this quality criteria, our second best attribute is to be fast.
Yeah. So
if researchers are waiting till you're submitted to the REB to figure out whether or not they need an ITA or a CTA or anything else, they're actually increasing delays. Those delays will be placed on the REB's back, but they're not.
Yeah, I agree.
So could we find a process whereby, because the REB can only raise the issue, we can't make a determination?
So education, number one, right?
Yeah.
I don't know the processes there. I do know that a lot of institutions within their ethics application have a question. So does this device involve an off-label, blah, blah, blah. Other than that,
so we do have it in our questions. The issue is who's responsible for looking at that question, because the REB will be sort of a second sober look, but we'll refer them back to the RI, or we'll refer them to Health Canada. The REB will not Canada.
Yeah.
We'll flag it, but it's just a big delay factor. And I'm sure the people who've submitted stuff get really frustrated when you say, go back and check with Health Canada. They could have done it way before. So that's my only comment. There's a process in, like, we can improve the process by working better together. And instead of waiting till the REB, do it beforehand when you can.
Yeah.
So to that point, that's part of the reason why we want you to present today, right? So that we increase awareness, Marie, right, within our RI community of the definitions of what's unlicensed, licensed, what the classes are, where they need to consider potentially submitting an ITA. So I guess this is one of the ways we're trying to improve the process. And a lot of it is repetition and continuous education. But perhaps looking at the questioning in the REB submission and or catching it sooner needs to be sort of worked on together. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes researchers they have no clue.
Yeah, you don't know what you don't know, right? That's the issue.
They have no idea.
Yeah.
And they're shocked when you tell them that they have to do this. Like they just have no one's trying to skirt around, not doing something. They just truly don't know.
Yeah.
So how do you educate? How do you get that word out? Another good way maybe is however procurement is done, ensuring that those folks aren't allowing people to procure a device without ensuring that it's licensed, because that unfortunately happens all the time too.
All right. That's a good point. But then again, that occurs after like if they're procuring the device already, it's like they're getting started. They're almost about to get started. So it's almost already too late in the game catching it there.
Yeah. Sometimes, unfortunately, they procure before because let's say you go to a seminar in the US and you see this device and somehow you're able to procure it. And then you're like, oh, I'm going to get one of those and I'm going to write a protocol. So unfortunately, sometimes there's just a couple of different ways, but I mean, it is education at the end of the day. It's just helping people know so that you're right. They don't get bottlenecked because we stop their whole process by saying, oh, sorry, you can't move forward. Now you need to do an ITA.
Yeah. So I'm guessing by that example you just used, you've kind of seen it all.
I have seen it all.
You've seen it all. Okay. Are there any other questions?
Cindy has some information. She says we have RI-MUHC SOPs on CTAs and ITAs, as well as a new course on medical device regulations. So everyone should probably look into that. We do have a question from Alyssa Maximov. To confirm, the REB nor any MUHC feasibility review will review for Health Canada regulations. It is the PI's responsibility, and the due diligence is the responsibility of the PI.
Am I on? Can you hear me?
Are you?
Yeah. Yeah. So ultimately, any, all that, everything, compliance training, scenarios surrounding CTAs, ITAs, it's the PI ultimately that has to be well informed. So, because the buck stops with them, ultimately. So, yeah, that's education and repetition and that making sure they know what they need to know, because you don't know what you don't know until it's too late. Okay. Any other comments? No. Lori, I'm going to put in a plug for you with our research community while you're here. I highly, highly, highly recommend that if you do have any questions regarding CTAs, ITAs, you're doubting, what path to take. Aside from referring to all the guidance documents and the documents that Lori made reference to in her presentation today, if you have any doubt, please reach out to her. Her email address, I'm going to shout it out, lcoaconsulting@gmail.com. But reach out to me. If you didn't catch that, I can circulate that to you. Okay, Lori, thank you. Thank you so much. Food for thought. Thank you.